Do you sometimes wonder how you could truly have an impact when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? How do you know you are moving in the right direction when it comes to becoming a more inclusive individual? As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod brings topics such as ethnicity, genders, sexuality, or religion on the table. We talk about research and science, but also emotions, feelings, and vulnerability. We discuss allyship, advocacy, and privilege. But most importantly, we talk action. Because without action, we stay still. And when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, stillness is never the answer. Welcome to As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. In this episode, I have the great pleasure to welcome Simon Houghton. Simon was born prematurely and as a result has a severe hearing loss. During the pandemic, he struggled because of his need to lip read when communicating with others, and the masks presented a significant barrier in this regard. Having had several negative experiences with places such as doctor surgeries or supermarkets, opticians or pharmacies, he wrote a post about the experience, and this was viewed over 110,000 times on LinkedIn. From this, he started the national campaign #WeSupportDeafAwareness, which aims to help organizations and their staff better communicate with the deaf and hard of hearing. Since the 12th of April, over 90,000 UK employees have now been given access to his training, and a range of organizations from FTSE 100, NHS, Charities, trade unions and small companies have joined the campaign. Please join me in giving Simon a very warm welcome for this episode of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Simon, thank you so much for being here on the podcast As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. It's a pleasure to have you. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to have the conversation. It's been a mad afternoon, but we managed to make it work. And I'm looking forward to talking about the subject that we're going to be talking about today.
Me too. Well, thank you very much again. So, the first question I'd like to ask you to kind of introduce yourself is, what's your story?
What's my story? Well, for the purpose, I probably have many different stories, but for the purpose of this podcast, the thing that's defined me during the pandemic, I guess, is I'm born deaf. I was a premature baby. For 40-something years, it's never really been an issue. I've managed, you get your ups and downs, but actually during the pandemic, I really struggled because, as well as being, a part of my deafness, I have a severe hearing impairment. Well, you might not know because of my speech, it's pretty good, but I have to lip read. And so all these people wear masks, as they should in terms of the pandemic, but that's caused a real barrier for communication. And so my story is basically trying to help organizations and employees to better communicate with the deaf. And that has come about as a result of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. I wanted to ask you another question, but before I start with that question, actually, what's the best way to talk about it? Do we talk about deaf? Do we talk about hearing impairment? Sure. Do we talk about both?
You know what? It's a really interesting topic. It's interesting that you say that question, because if you speak to 100 people who wear hearing aids, let's say, so to not use a particular word, but they all wear hearing aids, 100 people, mm-hmm. You'll probably find that they all have a different take on it. Some people say that I am deaf. Some people say that's derogatory. You shouldn't say that they're deaf. Some people say you shouldn't call me hearing impaired because impairment suggests I'm deficient in something. Some people don't like to be labeled disabled. And so I think the question is, I think the answer is that it can be all those things. But I think the key thing is to take it to a personal level. So ask the person, so how do you associate with your with what you have? You know, we're talking about, I see you're wearing hearing aids, you know, how would you, and some people might say, just ignore the hearing aids. Some people say, I tend to say that I'm deaf or hearing impaired. Me personally, I've used both over time. I have heard some people say that they don't like to use the term hearing impaired, but equally, not that long ago, I think hearing impaired, some people said it's coming back into fashion. So it's kind of it's a difficult thing to really answer. Me personally, I'm deaf. You know, I can't help it. I've got a hearing impairment. See, I use both in the same conversation. Yes. So it is it's a really interesting question. And I think some people who are not hearing impaired or deaf, they don't know what to say. So I think go in with a question of service to the other individual. Ask them and say, I don't want to offend you, but I'm really interested to know about, you know, you're wearing hearing aids. Can I ask you more about that? And they would probably say, oh, well, I've been deaf since birth. And then you could say, oh, so do you say deaf as opposed to something else? And then that can get the conversation started. So ask on a personal level rather than maybe labeling a population, for example.
No, that's a very good point, and it's interesting when you're saying that, actually, because if we take it in the bigger picture of diversity and inclusion, I think this is something that is very recurrent in many discussions about being open, being curious, not having that kind of judgment pre-made, but really asking the questions. What works for the person in front of us, actually, because it's for them at the end of the day to decide. And
I love the word curious. Be curious. And you're doing it because you're interested, not because you want to label somebody unnecessarily. So yeah, in a roundabout sort of way, I think we came to an answer.
Well, thank you. So talking about deafness or hearing impairment, it's something that is often kind of not visible to most people, because I think there is kind of there are different levels, obviously. I mean, you mentioned you being deaf from birth. Other people will happen maybe later. For some, I imagine it's very strong and they're completely deaf. Others, it's more of an impairment maybe, or something. So the visibility of it is not very strong. So if when I think about me in my own shoes, what are some of these challenges that you may be coming across? You mentioned one actually during the pandemic, but what are some of these challenges that you may be coming across that I might be unaware of and I might not see?
Well, I think it's really interesting because it is a continuum. In my way, there's a continuum. There's some people think that, you know, if you're deaf, you are completely deaf. So I think that's one thing in terms of hard of hearing and hearing impaired and deafness. Just in my view, if you're deaf, it means that you have a level of hearing that is less than you would normally have. You know, so and I don't want to go into the disabled or whatever. I don't need to do that. But I think in terms of the levels, I mean, you've got people who are born profoundly deaf. You know, and they can't hear anything. So they grow up in a culture where signing, BSL, ASL, wherever they might be, what kind of sign language that they have, they grow up doing that. That is their whole world. There are others who aren't deaf when they're born and maybe just in their 60s and 70s as they get older, you know, their cell breakdown, they start to lose their hearing. Now, it's hard for some people who become deaf later on in life, because a skill that I've developed is I can lip read. I was born deaf. So I have been lip reading since I could talk, since I could see. And so it's a really interesting dynamic that just because I can lip read and I'm deaf doesn't mean to say somebody else can lip read as well.
True.
So I think it's not assuming what somebody might have in terms of a deficient way or a difficulty in communicating, but ultimately it's about communication. So there is a barrier. On a very basic level, if somebody puts their hand in front of their mouth and somebody does lip read, or if I lip read, then I'm going to really struggle.
Mm-hmm.
So what I say to people is I ask them to ask the person who might be deaf and say, how can I best communicate with you? Okay,
Yes.
so then that way you're giving the person who's deaf or hard of hearing, I don't want to say, giving them the onus is on them, the empowerment is with them to say, well, I'd really like it if you could sign language with me, or do you have a piece of paper and I can write something down, or just stand in front of me because I can lip read. So to answer your question about, some of the challenges, it centers predominantly around communication. I struggle in certain circumstances. So when you're in a group of people, say you go to a restaurant, then you've got a background noise. So all the hubbub, all going on in the background, it's very difficult to concentrate.
Yes.
So you have this noise that you're trying to block out, and some hearing aids are better than others. So you can actually have different settings on the hearing aids. So the set that can be directional. So if we were sat opposite a table, I could change the setting on my hearing aid to block out as much as it can background noise and just focus on the sound directly in front of me. Or you can have it so that it's bi-directional, it's going all over the 360 degrees, as it were. The other thing I struggle personally is in workshops. So in a working environment, you'll have people. So if I'm talking to you in a restaurant and there's lots of background noise, that's one thing. If I'm talking to you and say 6 other friends around a table in a restaurant or in a workshop, the thing about deafness, for people who can hear something, they don't hear everything. Sounds a bit strange. So, I only hear about 20% of what is being said because of the frequency challenge. I can't hear high-pitched sounds. So I can hear like the vowels, the low-pitched sound, the A, E, I, O, U, but or the high-pitched, I can't hear those.
Okay.
So I will only hear certain sounds and certain words when said. So what I say to people is, I might hear something like the something sat on the something. I'm like, I don't know what those 2 words are. Were the words important? Were they the word and or the not important? Was it a noun or a name of a person or something? Was it critical to the sentence? The next sentence might be something, something, cat. And so what a person who's deaf is trying to do is trying to fill in the gaps. And we used to play a game called Hangman when we were kids, and you have a phrase or a word and you drew the hangman. What I play all day, every day is mental hangman. So I'm trying to fill in the gaps. And what happens is the first sentence I have the something sat on the something. Next sentence, something, something, cat. Oh, did something sit on the cat? Or did the cat sit on something? And then the third sentence, something, something, car. Did the cat sit on the car? But then I've still got gaps in the next few sentences. So you're constantly referring back, and it's incredibly mentally draining. So you're constantly trying to figure out what you haven't heard. So that's one thing. And the other thing is because I have to lip read and I rely so heavily on lip reading that if I'm in with a group of people and someone starts talking, I don't hear what they're saying. I just hear this noise. So I'm looking around like a meerkat. You know, the meerkats in the wild, they're like looking around. You get neck ache because you're looking around and you go like, where did that noise come from? And then you zone in on the mouth moving. Then I start to hear something, something, cat, something, something, whatever. So I've missed the first part of what that person said. And then somebody else decides to chip in. I'm like, oh, somebody else is talking. Who was that? And then you find the next person, you've missed the beginning. So for somebody who has a hearing impairment and you work with them, first thing I'd say is they're not going to know what you say at the beginning of a sentence. So you might want to start the sentence saying, hello, everyone, my name is Simon. I might just get to the point where you say Simon, but I haven't heard the question. Rather than say, I disagree, I've missed that bit. But if it's like, hi, it's Simon, I have a question. By now, I've seen you, I'm settling in, I can see and I can hear what you say. So it's about having consideration, putting yourself in the shoes of someone who's deaf so that you can best allow them to hear what you're saying. So simple things like, when you talk to somebody, make sure you're facing them. Now, not everyone lip reads, but even if you don't lip read, if you're facing towards them, your sound is traveling towards the person.
And I remember actually you mentioning when we spoke at the beginning about your family, I believe.
Yes.
That you remind them regularly, I cannot lip read around the corner.
That's right. I say that all the time.
Yeah, it's but it's true that this is okay. This is a very obvious example, but we don't always think indeed it being in the same room that actually there is indeed that time to adjust and understand who is the person speaking. Make sure that we're facing each other, so it's easier for you to be able to read, because not putting, like I just did right now, put my hands in front of my face.
Well, and you're absolutely right. And some of my best friends from university, and this is going back into the early 90s when I was at university, they used to say, if you want to talk about Simon but don't want him to hear, just do that, and they put the hand in front of their mouth. And they were years ahead, because obviously the pandemic and the mask as a result. But it is, and again, it's about asking. So the difficulty is, of course, is because, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's a hidden disability. So you may not know that someone's deaf. I'm very good at disguising my hearing. The main way I do that is because my speech is pretty good. Now, if I was profoundly deaf, my speech may not be quite as good. And every time I open my mouth, you might be reminded, oh yes, I remember Simon's deaf. I need to do this because that's best for him. But because my speech is good, my children, my wife, my family, my co-workers, my friends, they forget because they're not. It doesn't remind them. So it is difficult with a hidden disability, and I think it's just a matter of. I think there's an onus on the individual as well, the deaf person. So I use humor, but I try to help people. And today at work, people were talking to me with their mask on. I'm going, oh, sorry, I have to lip read. And they go, oh, yeah, fine. And so I think it's incumbent on the deaf person to try and be open, because people don't know. I am not going to get upset with somebody if they don't know that I'm deaf and they're trying to, they're talking to me and they're facing the other way. So they need to be educated. And that's where my deaf awareness campaign comes from. But equally, I think, and it goes back to being curious. If the person who's curious is say, how can I better communicate with you? And then ask them. But of course, as we say, the signs are difficult because it's a hidden disability. So that in itself is a whole new topic. And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, the biggest clue is that they might wear hearing aids. But some people have long hair, and some people, females and men as well, they want to disguise. They don't like wearing hearing aids. So maybe they don't wear hearing aids, even though they should because of their level. So it's a really difficult subject. But I think the key thing, as we've talked about, be curious. And I think it's asking the deaf person or the person who's got hard of hearing, say, how can I best communicate? And then hopefully they'll be open enough to sort of say, do you know what, I'm really struggling in this meeting. It would be really good if I could. I'll give you an example, just a tip for the listeners. When you sit opposite somebody who's deaf, right, and they might lip read, make sure the window is not directly behind you. Because if it's sunny, then your whole face goes into a bit of a silhouette, and it's difficult to lip read. So when I go into meetings, I get in. People think I'm keen. I'm always the first person in the meeting room. It's not that. I might not want to be there, but what I do is I position myself as in the right place so that I'm not facing the window with people in front of me, because that will make it harder for me to hear.
And I imagine actually now as well, you talked about the pandemic bringing its challenges with the masks, but there is also probably some challenges with having to be online quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
And doing Zoom meetings, or actually no video meetings, suddenly for sure is a big issue. So you cannot do lip reading.
It's been, yes, it has. And certain cultures, and I would say certain countries, but also certain cultures within organizations, they may or may not want to use video, even if they've got the capacity to, using Teams. I've worked in numerous companies where I've run a presentation and every single one of them are on a blank screen. It's just, I can just see myself. Other times people are, oh, okay, put the video on. The good thing about some of the products that you can get, for video calls, they have subtitles. So it's not brilliant. And in fact, actually, some people I've seen from the deaf community, they call them craptions rather than captions, because it is actually it is a little bit like that mental hangman. So the words come along and you're like, oh, I don't think they said that. And then you try and work it out based on what comes next. Yeah. So it is actually very mentally draining being deaf on the video, but also in face to face. But it's, I can't imagine what it would have been like if I didn't have the likes of Zoom and Teams during the pandemic, because I would have really struggled to collaborate with colleagues, with my family. I do use a telephone. I say to people, I use a telephone when it's, with my family. But when it's important, like, car insurance or Chinese takeaway order, I get my wife to do the important things in life. So she tends to do that. But yes, it is a challenge. It is a challenge.
So in response to all these challenges, you launched the Deaf Awareness campaign, I believe. What's that all about? Tell us a little bit more about it.
So.
And the name gives a clue a little bit. But,
yes. So the campaign's called, I actually put hashtag because I think, I'm not very technical, but, you try and create a slogan that could potentially go viral or within on social media. So it's hashtag we support deaf awareness.
Yes.
All one word. And basically, I struggled during the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, in all different, doctors' surgeries, hospital appointments, pharmacy, opticians, supermarket, all the essential services that were on at the start of the pandemic. And the straw that broke the camel's back is I went to an optician's, and the person had a face shield and a mask on. And I must have said about 12 or 14 times during that consultation, I said, I'm really sorry, I'm deaf. I can't have to lip read. I can't hear what you're saying. And that person didn't do anything differently. They just carried on. And I could feel my frustration level building up. And I was a bit worried that I was cheating. When you have to see something, and they had this thing put on my nose and it wasn't really tight and I wasn't sure whether I was doing it right. I was getting wound up. And at the very end of the session, she said, floaters, come back to the opticians. Something that I didn't hear, go straight to A&E or the emergency room. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't hear what you're saying, but you said something fairly important. And by now my frustration was so high that I said, look, my wife is downstairs. Can you tell my wife? So we went downstairs, we got some glasses, fixed some glasses out. The lady told my wife, and then we left the opticians. And she said, and I said to my wife, what did the optician say? And she says, oh, if you have a detached retina, if you get a detached retina, go straight to A&E. And I felt like, I had all these questions. And I felt isolated because I thought, why did you say that? What are the symptoms? What do I do? What can I do to stop it from happening? Is it going to be in both eyes? I just didn't know. And so I felt really kind of angry that I didn't get the opportunity to do that. And then fast forward 2 weeks later, I had to go and pick up my glasses. And my wife couldn't come with me. So she works for the NHS and she was on call. So she couldn't come with me. I had to go on my own. I had to be brave. I had to go on my own. And so I thought, what can I do to stop that encounter happening again? So what I did was, and if anyone's watching the video, so what I did was I doctored my mask. So I had a mask and I put deaf on one side and lip read on the other. I don't know if you can see that. And I put that on and I went to the optician, so I opened the door and you had the like little COVID station. And the lady, before saying anything, she just took a step back, she pulled the mask down and she said, "How can I help?" And that was the first time anyone has made any attempt to help me out. Yeah. And I spoke to the lady and I said, what did you think of this? And she said, "Oh, it's a brilliant idea. I knew what to do." So I wrote about it on LinkedIn. It had about 110,000 views, lots of questions about, I didn't realize deaf people would struggle with masks and all these, well, it seems obvious to me, but then, it's not obvious for everyone. So I did lots of engagement and I said, "Does anybody fancy some training? Just some basic deaf awareness training?" Anyway, cut long story short, I did that training for about 60 people. It went really well. Lots of people said it was really helpful. Someone said it was a great conversation starter at their home, around the dinner table, talking about people who were struggling during the pandemic. And so what I decided to, and another couple of things happened, but what I ended up doing was starting this campaign. And for those of you who are on the video, basically these little cards, about A4, A5 size, they call "We Support Deaf Awareness" on a big yellow background. And the idea is that shop windows, doctors' surgeries, A&E waiting departments, any office or reception area, if they've got this in the window or somewhere around their, around the office, it tells people, visitors, employees, and customers that the people in the room have had some training and understand deaf awareness. And what I've done is I put my training online. It's like 12 modules. You don't get a degree in deaf studies or anything. You get, it's an hour and a half, but you get an understanding of what it's like to be deaf. And some of the things you mentioned about the challenges, talks about, what's it like to have to lip read? What are the tools that deaf people use? What can you do? And tips on face-to-face, telephone, and video calls, actually. So we've got all that. And we launched it on the 12th of April at a retail park in the UK in Reading called the Oracle Centre. And all 100 retailers had that in their windows. And that was middle of April. And now we're sort of, it's just beginning of September. We've now given over 92,000 employees have access to the training. So there's a whole range from NHS trusts up and down the country, charities, FTSE 100 corporations, government offices, and small businesses as well. So it's going really well. My aim, my vision is, I don't know, you kind of say, I've got 100 shops. What's my vision? I know, 1 million people to have access to my training. I'm like, what was I thinking about? So I've got a long way to go. I reckon by the end of September, we'll be at over 100,000 just because of the number of organizations that are really keen, really interested in it. All they do is that they get the posters, stick them in the windows, stick them in the offices, and allow their teams to have training. And it's really easy, but it's been proven to be a really great way for people to kind of take a step back and understand, actually, this person is struggling. And what I've said in my campaign manifesto, if you like, basically it boils down to 3 behaviors. it basically boils down to being kinder,
Mhm.
having empathy, and having patience. And that's not just around deaf awareness either.
Mhm.
It's about, somebody who might be partially sighted and they're struggling to navigate in a shop. It might be an old lady trying to get her money out of her purse. And I think what I found in the pandemic was the first lockdown, we were all very keen. And in the UK, every Thursday, we were banging on the pots and we were shouting for the NHS and we did all wonderful things. And then we came out of the lockdown and then we had to go back in again. And I got the sense that we weren't quite as tolerant as we were first time round. And that's really where I think we need to be more kinder, more empathetic, and have more patience. And I think that's actually that's the ultimate goal, but it's been driven with a purpose around deaf awareness.
Yeah. And it's very interesting. You're saying that. I was reading an article earlier on actually about that. It was more around the organizational side, but how a lot of organizations, when it comes to diversity and inclusion in the bigger picture, actually very quickly became complacent. And I think that's a little bit what you were sharing here with the lockdown as well, is I think as soon as we start seeing some results, we go, okay, it's going in the right direction, and then we tend to forget about it. And actually, it's important to keep going, because if we truly want to be inclusive individuals, this is not a one-off job. And as we discussed already on numerous occasions, we have different people who have different needs when it comes to being included and belong into the community. So we have to actually have different ways to bring them in and to make sure that they feel. I think you mentioned at some point a word that was very touching and strong. You felt isolated. So we need to make sure that people don't feel isolated. So it's a great message to have.
It's a really interesting point you raise, and I guess I'm lucky enough in that my background, my career, I'm a behavior and organizational change consultant. So I've been doing that for 20 years. The deaf awareness campaign is a tactic for diversity and inclusion, but a diversity and inclusion, you won't become a diverse and inclusive organization by having the odd tactic like a deaf campaign or something like that. It's basically come down to culture change. And so you have to consider the longer term, bigger picture. And then all of the things that come into play, like, does your leadership truly buy into what you're trying to do? Do you have a vision that people from the top to the bottom of your organization actually understand? Often you'll see visions from companies like shareholder value and top quartile and all this sort of stuff. But if you speak to your receptionist, and she's like, I have no idea, I'm just here for my minimum wage job. So you need to make sure that it's understood throughout. And then things like having champions. So you have champions to keep the momentum going in various parts of your organization. So what I do as part of the Deaf Awareness campaign, the organizations that join, they have, I send a monthly email out so that it's got, progress on the campaign, giving a bit of momentum in that respect, but also tips on what they should be doing. Because I have no control over how many people in the organization actually, A, complete the training, and B, utilize the knowledge that they've gained from that training. So I try to impart some tips, and then every quarter, every 3 months, we have like a Zoom call or a Teams call, a video call, where they will all come on the call, and we have guest speakers. We'll have FTSE 100 company clients saying, this is what we did, so that the NHS hospitals and the charities and the small businesses can say, hey, what a great idea, we hadn't thought of that. And vice versa, what can the NHS teach the FTSE 100 companies? So by that keeps the momentum going. But ultimately, if you want to strive to be a diverse and inclusive organization, it has to be a culture. it has to be your value and it has to be the culture. And just having a one-off campaign, it will die off eventually. So you need to keep that momentum going, and it's hard, but it's what some people have been brought into organizations to do. So hopefully they'll continue doing it.
So we did, I think we did a good job already talking a little bit about not just the awareness, but also what are some kind of these tips and tricks, and you shared a few already. But I believe you told me in a previous chat that you have that list of kind of 6 or 7 things, if I remember well, that you can do. Can you share a little bit more about some of these actions that people can take?
Yeah, sure. So what I did was, so when we went live in the retail centre, it was on the day that all of the staff were coming back off furlough. So they hadn't had time to do the training. So I came up with a number of tips, and I'll share those tips, and came up with a number of tips that they could read on like a cheat sheet. So they hadn't done the training, but they had kind of understood. So the first one is get lippy. It's called Get Lippy, nice and simple. Obviously more prevalent in the pandemic, but take a step back, make sure that you're socially distanced, pull the mask down, and just ask, how can I best communicate with you? So I mentioned empowering the individual. Others include making sure, it's called face on, making sure you're face on. So when you're communicating with somebody who you know to be deaf, don't be turning away or looking down. Make sure you're always facing that person. Another one is making sure that it's called hands-free, making sure you're not putting your hand in front of your mouth. I talk a lot about people they've grown their pandemic beard, the 18 months, and their beard's amazing, but they're loving it all the time, and they're putting their hand all over their chins. That's difficult for people to lip read. So make sure that you do that. And then, of course, mentioned about the sunlight. So making sure that you're conscious of where you are. And then finally, making sure that when you're with somebody, I think it really comes down to being open and curious. It's actually asking them, what can we do differently? And I think that the key, we started off at the beginning with, be curious. And I think, whilst that's not actually a standard tip in the cheat sheet, I think that's possibly the most important one. It's possibly the one that's missing. It's about being curious and coming from an angle of servitude rather than ignorance. It's about saying, what can I do to help you? So I think if you come with that, and the reason I say that is that my wife, as I mentioned, she works in a hospital and she teaches CPR. So she teaches for heart attacks and cardiac arrest. And some people are quite scared. I don't want to do anything because I might do something wrong. And my wife's going, well, they're probably going to die anyway. All right. So if you don't do anything, any CPR, don't do the compressions or if you do nothing, the chances are that person's not going to live. So whatever you do is going to be better than nothing. So if you want to do 30 breaths and 1 compression, or 30 compressions and 1 breath, great. You're doing something to help. And it's exactly the same with working with someone who's deaf. Just the fact that you're trying is amazing to me. I've had people come up to me and said, "Oh, I hear that you're deaf." I said, "Yeah." Said, "How are you?" And I'm like, okay, well, it's a little bit condescending, but you know what? You're trying, and if you're trying, you can be educated. So I think be curious. I think that's the key thing. Be curious, and don't be afraid to call. If somebody wants to be called deaf, and you think they should be called hard of hearing or having an impairment, just go with the flow. But I think that people will respect you more, because I said, you know what, this person clearly has no idea, but they're keen, they're curious, and they're trying. And I think that's amazing. And if everybody did that, I think that would be fantastic.
We'd definitely be living in a better world, that's for sure. And that's a beautiful message to share as well. towards the end as well. So thank you very much for that.
Sure.
Some of the last questions I want to ask you, actually, it's one questions, but it's two questions in one.
Oof.
The first one, which is, if people want to learn more about the topic, want to get in touch with you, how do they do that? And the second question is, if they want to participate in the deaf awareness campaign, support it or listen to the training, how can they do that?
Oh, that would be amazing if anyone's interested. So it's nice and simple. It's www.wesupportdeafawareness.org, ORG on the end. There's information on there. We're also on LinkedIn, so type in for We Support Deaf Awareness. In Twitter, you can get in contact with Twitter. It's deaf_aware. That's my handle. So I'm more than happy to talk to people. I do presentations to organizations on deaf awareness. People say that they're quite funny, they're quite humorous. It's a nice way to bring to light what can for some people a very serious topic, but I do it with a bit of a comedy and a bit of fun. So do that. But yes, and if people wanted to do that, I'm more than happy to talk to them. And if organizations want to get involved, they can go to the website or contact me on LinkedIn. It's Simon Houghton, that's Houghton, or look up We Support Deaf Awareness on LinkedIn as well, and they can get me in touch. They get in touch with me that way as well.
Brilliant. Well, as always, I'll put all this information in the notes of the episode as well, so it's easy for people to find everything. But thank you very much, Simon. It was a pleasure to have you. There is still so much I think we could talk about. Maybe we'll think of another topic for another episode at some point.
I'd love that. And in fact, what I guess I didn't mention it, but what I'm hoping to do with the Deaf Awareness campaign, probably something for next year, is to change that into hidden disabilities. So to extend the training so that it's not just about deafness, because deafness is one, but there's multitude of autism, Crohn's disease, learning difficulties. Again, trying to help educate organizations and staff to kind of like, how can I best support that individual? So maybe there's a topic in that, and maybe we can just chew the fat on culture change and diversity and inclusion
as well. Yes,
I look forward to that. And
later, definitely in a year time, when you move on with the bigger topic, for sure we can have a bit of an update of where you are on your 1 million people trained. And
a long way to go with that one, but yeah, it keeps me motivated. So I would absolutely love to come back, and I'll give you an update when the time comes. That'd be awesome.
Brilliant. For now, thank you so much again, and looking forward to seeing how the campaign moves forward as well.
Love it, and thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to catching up with you soon.
Thanks. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. To catch all the latest from us, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.